Hello everyone, my name is Preston Dennett, and thank you for joining me for a new episode of UFOs and the Paranormal. I just love talking about humanoid cases, as you probably know. I've got 10 amazing cases for you today. I call this episode, I Felt No Fear. 10 very weird humanoid encounters. And yes, I promise you they are very weird. Not just grays, a wide variety of humanoids today. I've got cases from all over the world, including Brazil, France, as well as Arkansas, California, New Jersey, New Mexico, Ohio, Tennessee, Texas, and Wisconsin. These cases date from 1950 to 2016. They involve quite a wide variety of evidence. We have animal reactions, we have physiological effects, we have landing traces, we even have photographs and electromagnetic disturbances. Really the entire range, just about, of evidence. Don't want to spend too much longer doing the intro. Let's just get to the cases because that is what is the most interesting. So, first case I'd like to talk about today, I call It Took My Breath Away. This one took place in May of 1950, very early one morning in Vaux-en-Dieulet, France. I love this case. It's probably my favorite of the bunch. It involves two witnesses, a very close-up encounter with quite an unusual humanoid, landing traces, animal reactions. It's just a really amazing case. This fascinating case comes from French researcher Jean-Michel Ligeron and appears in his book OVNI en Ardennes. There are two witnesses, Madeleine Pirard and her father. Madeleine was 14 years old. It was 6:30 one morning in May of 1950 as she and her father walked with their dog up in the fields of their farm in rural Vaux-en-Dieulet to check on their cows. And looking up, Madeleine saw this glowing, fiery-looking object and shouted out, "Dad, look at the sun! It's awfully close." Her father immediately looked up and said, "That's impossible, that's not the sun." Not only was this object in the wrong direction, it was making a strange sound, and he told her, "Listen." And they could both hear this sort of hoo, 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 hoo sound. That's how they described it. Immediately, this object sort of transformed into this strange spherical shape, and, as Madeleine says, it was like a ball of fire. It approached, then landed in front of us. My father told me not to move or go any closer for fear I would be burned. My father told me, "Don't move, whatever you do." It was after the sphere had stopped moving that we realized it was more like a kind of saucer. I then saw right in front of me, inside the object, which was completely translucent like glass, a little man about 1.4 meters tall, with his arms outstretched, perhaps hampered by the spacesuit he was wearing. He was wearing a kind of motorcycle helmet with a plexiglass visor, and two tubes were apparently connected to two cylinders above his shoulders. What shocked me most was that it seemed to me that he was staring at me constantly. I felt completely paralyzed throughout this observation, especially by his gaze, which seemed fixed on me. I felt a kind of heat wave similar to the one felt when sunbathing. This saucer gave off an incredible heat. It felt like the sun beating down on your skin. So this object, they said, was about 12 to 15 feet wide and about 4.5 to 5 feet tall. It had a tiny little sphere on top. It had no visible equipment of any kind inside, not that they could see. No levers, no controls, nothing but this figure. So this object was no more than 15, maybe 20 feet away from them both. Both Madeleine and her father remained completely still. Mostly, Madeleine says, she paid attention to the figure because he looked very unusual. As she says, the man was just standing upright under the small dark dome, which was itself surmounted by a kind of small antenna. That's mainly why he was standing there, right in the middle of the craft. There wasn't much space above his head, and his kind of helmet seemed to be connected to the top. There must have been a cable connecting him to this kind of ball above. He seemed to be wearing a suit, like a Michelin man, made of gray rubber. His feet were clad in very large shoes, and his feet were big. It looked strange. But what struck me most were his eyes. Oh, those eyes! He was looking at me. I can still see his eyes staring at me. So this encounter lasted about 2 minutes. Then, as Madeline says, the object rose like a spinning top, rotating slightly on itself, ascending in successive stages, emitting the same sound as before, after which it moved away and disappeared. Madeline does recall that following this encounter, her father was incredibly shocked. As she says, "I remember he was pale and ashen. He didn't know where he was when he got home. In fact, he had to sit down to recover. He didn't even go to tie up the cows in the barn. He didn't move. He almost fainted." Following this event, they both saw that the area where this object had hovered was badly burned, the vegetation. As Madeline says, it was burned brown. The earth was all cracked, like when it hasn't rained for a very long time. It was unimaginable. The earth was so burned that there was no more grass. Moreover, the grass took a very long time to grow back in that spot, at least 2 years. The animals, the cows, 8 days after the sighting, were circling the spot where the UFO had landed. It was as if they sensed something. Every time they reached the top of the pasture, they sensed I don't know what, and for a very long time they avoided the area. So Madeline herself was deeply impressed by the encounter. She returned to the spot many times to gaze in wonder, and for the rest of her life this encounter remained seared in her memory. As she says, "I still see it resting on the field. I will see that for the rest of my life, right in front of me." Quite an unusual case. It's so interesting to me because there are quite a few cases involving this type of ET, the Michelin Man. So weird. There's probably a dozen cases like this that I know of. I should really do a whole episode on just Michelin Man encounters, but I've covered all of these over the years, and these cases come from all over the world. So I don't know, maybe this is a particular type of ET, a particular type of spacesuit that they wear. Very hard to say, but just an amazing case. So now let's move to the next one. This one also struck me as quite peculiar, very unusual. I call this one a cold scientific mind. This one took place one afternoon in spring of 1954 in Norco, California. At that time, this was a pretty rural area. And yeah, this one is absolutely unusual and involves what appears to be human-looking ETs. Or maybe not ETs at all, maybe us. You can make up your own mind about it, but I think it's an important case. This case was originally investigated by researcher Donald B. Hanlon and was published in the May-June 1968 issue of the Flying Saucer Review. Donald was one of the early researchers who took humanoid cases seriously, and in fact worked closely with Charles Bowen, who was the editor of the Flying Saucer Review and wrote one of the first books on humanoid cases. The witnesses in this case include a married couple and their 5-year-old daughter, but the primary witness is Mrs. J. Their real names are known by the researcher, but the witnesses insisted upon anonymity. They initially did not report their encounter for fear of ridicule, and because at that time the Air Force's negative attitude towards that subject was absolutely off the charts. It was lunchtime one afternoon in spring of 1954. They were in their home in Norco, California, and Mr. and Mrs. J and their daughter sat down to eat in their single-story cottage. As they all began to eat, all three gradually became aware of an odd-sounding, kind of metallic droning coming from outside. And as it became increasingly loud, Mr. J, who suffered badly from arthritis in his neck and spine, which rendered him effectively disabled, he suggested that Mrs. J go outside to investigate. So she agreed. She and her 5-year-old daughter went to the back door of their home and looked outside. The fog had been thick that morning and it was just clearing up, but almost immediately they saw a strange object moving at a pretty slow speed. They estimate about 5 miles per hour, and it was moving at a low elevation behind the house. This object moved to a position above a tree about 15 feet from the house and came to a complete stop there. at which point the loud humming noise decreased to where it was just a soft hum. The object they could now see had a shape somewhat resembling a rowboat with a transparent dome on top. They said it was aluminum-colored, metallic, about 20 feet long and 10 feet wide, with no protrusions of any kind. Inside this dome, they could see 5 men seated in a semicircular position facing the witnesses. Per Mrs. J, the men had dark hair and eyes, long faces, and dull olive-colored skin, and were wearing neutral-colored uniforms with helmets. Now, upon seeing her, the men in this craft leaned forward and stared very intently at Mrs. J and her daughter. In fact, one of the men in particular, says Miss J, seemed to, quote, gaze right through them. So she had the impression that the man had a, quote, cold scientific mind and was dissecting me bit by bit. She had no idea why the men seemed so interested in them, but there was little doubt in her mind that they were, because as Mrs. J says, they definitely stared. One in particular looked right into my eyes. I wish I had the presence of mind to have talked to them, but I stood there gaping, completely flabbergasted. So Mrs. J said that the staring contest lasted for at least a full minute before the men leaned back in their seats. Then the metallic droning noise grew loud again, and the object moved off to the northeast, disappearing into the fog at an estimated 35 miles per hour. They immediately ran back inside and told Mr. J what they had seen. He himself confirmed that he heard the object as it moved off into the distance, becoming quieter and quieter, and in fact he could even tell which direction it had departed by the sound. So Mrs. J was so amazed by the sighting, she felt certain that other people in the area must have seen this, and she waited eagerly to see if any reports would appear in the newspaper, which of course they did not. But she suspected that, like her, other people who had seen the craft were simply too afraid to come forward. So she kept it secret for more than a decade. She told nobody with the exception of a few close friends and family members. But in 1968, about 14 years after the encounter, she finally contacted UFO researchers who investigated the case. At that time, the daughter had grown up. She also remembers the incident and describes it exactly as her mother did, with just a minor difference, saying only that she remembered the object being longer and slimmer. Now, both witnesses were reluctant to ascribe an extraterrestrial explanation to the object and the occupants, and in fact, Mrs. J told researchers, quote, there was something quite earthly about it. She also had the impression that the craft was, as she said, old. So I don't know, you tell me, do you think those were extraterrestrials, or do you think that was possibly a reverse engineered craft piloted by people from here? I really couldn't tell you. I find it quite interesting that these human-looking figures seem to show such interest in the witnesses. To me, that points towards them being extraterrestrials. But I wasn't there. The witnesses themselves feel like this was probably earthly. Very hard to say. It's an early case, but I do think that at that time we really did start to reverse engineer this type of ET technology. There's a lot to unpack with all of these humanoid cases, so there's always more where that came from. Here's another one which is super complex and interesting, to me at least. I call this one, It Still Gives Me Chills. This one took place in 1981 in Vaux-en-Dieulet, Wisconsin. It is a single witness case, but it's got some really unique and interesting elements to it. This is a first-hand eyewitness account from a witness who submitted her testimony to MUFON in 2013. This is about 32 years after it occurred. She is anonymous, so I'll call her Debbie. At the time of her encounter, 1981, she was a little girl of about 7 or 8 years, living in her family's home in Vaux-en-Dieulet, Wisconsin. The house had a basement, which Debbie did not like, and she avoided it, not only because her father had a workshop down there with a large sump pump hole, which he had instructed her to avoid, but also because it had spider webs all over and was dark and scary. So I'll just let Debbie explain what happened in her own words, because she describes it very well. As Debbie says, "One night, I felt as though I had to go down to the basement. For some reason, I went down there after bed. Everyone in the house was asleep. I believe it was the first time I was ever down there alone. I walked into my dad's workshop, and I saw a glowing light underneath one of his workbenches. He had several holes drilled into the tabletops, and I was drawn to the light. I looked at the top of the table, and I saw a white, glowing, skinny, bony-looking finger come out of one of the holes. The next thing I remember is I was standing face to face with this white, glowing creature with huge black eyes and a small little mouth. I thought it was a weird little kid of some kind because it was my size. The body was extremely skinny. The head was large on top and small at the chin. It had no ears. It seemed friendly, and for some reason I assumed it was a girl. I was not scared at all and stood there having a conversation with it, except it didn't talk to me. It just seemed to send messages to my mind instead of talking. I remember thinking it was really cool. It made me think, by talking into my mind, that it had others close by and had to get back to them. I remember asking it if it wanted to see my swing set in the backyard, and I remember it telling me it had some kind of plane or ship to get to, and it was located maybe across the street from my house. I don't remember going back upstairs at all or how the visit ended. So although this visit was not the least bit scary at the time it occurred, the next day Debbie became freaked out about it and extremely scared about what had happened. She was too scared to tell her parents and wonders if perhaps the little alien in the basement told her not to say anything about it. So she kept it to herself and just tried to pass it off as some kind of weird dream. But years later, as an adult, she began to see images of aliens on TV. And when she saw the pictures of greys, she realized that they looked pretty much exactly like what she saw, with the one difference was that the figure she saw seemed to glow with light. So as an adult, she finally did tell her parents. And she now does believe it was probably a gray alien, and this is what encouraged her to submit a report. And as Debbie says, "This is going to sound a little odd. Honestly, I would like to say it was just a dream. But to this day, the memory still gives me chills. Every time I saw pictures of aliens, I was even more convinced that what I experienced was real. How could I have made up something so similar to everyone else? I know this sounds insane, but it really felt 100% real to me." I'm pretty sure that that did not involve a dream. The chances of someone dreaming a gray ET in such detail, one that's practically identical to so many reports from fully conscious witnesses, just seems to me the chances of that are really small. I like that case also because the witness was able to hold a conversation with this little glowing gray. Another interesting thing is that this gray was glowing with light. That is not super common. I have heard a few other reports of this, but I'm not sure how that is accomplished or what even that exactly means. So all these little details really add up to, I think, showing that we still have a lot to learn about what's going on here. That's why I like covering these cases. Each case adds another piece of the puzzle to what's going on here, such as this next very unusual case. I call this one Something That Is Not Supposed to Be There. This one occurred one evening in October of 1987 in Lucasville, Ohio. This is a single witness case, but I do like the fact that the witness did provide their first-hand eyewitness testimony. There's some unusual details about it as well, and I think you'll find it a pretty compelling case. The witness in this case is anonymous, so I've given her the pseudonym Preston. She was 17 years old when she had her encounter. She was a senior in high school, living in her family's home in Lucasville, Ohio. And it was one evening in October 1987. She woke up in the middle of the night because she was cold. And she was startled to see that her bed covers had been pulled down to her feet. It was weird because the same thing had happened the 2 previous nights, each time her covers being all rolled up in a pile over her feet. This third night, however, something much weirder occurred. As Kristen says, as I focus to look at the roll of covers, I see something round and glisten at the wall, about where the doorknob would be. Then I realize that the round thing is an eye, and it is glistening because it is moving as it looks from side to side. So this made Kristen feel suddenly vulnerable, and she attempted to reach for the covers, and this is when she discovered that she was unable to move. And this made her a little angry. So with a great effort of willpower, she did manage to lift her head off the pillow. She just lifted her head high up enough to look towards the wall and saw now that there was a being with very large eyes standing by the wall looking at her. And as Kristen says, this is when I really noticed the eyes glistening and moving, big, like horse eyes or something, dark and shiny. I see this face and upper torso still standing against the wall staring at me. I think that the being is wearing something very dark blue, or its skin is dark blue. It could be very hairy, or its clothes are dimpled like it is wearing a padded suit. I have now managed to lift my shoulders from the bed, and for just a second, I believe that I see the whole being still standing there against the wall. It is at this point that something like a hand smacks me on the forehead and shoved my head back into the pillow. So that promptly ended Kristen's encounter, and in fact, she forgot about the entire incident. It wasn't until she had taken her shower the next evening and was getting ready for bed, she had turned off her bedroom lights, and this is when she had a sudden, full-blown panic attack. In fact, she felt sure that something was in her room, and she immediately began to diligently search the entire room, looking under the bed, in the closet, into every crack, crevice, and corner in her room, frantically looking for something that she says, quote, that is not supposed to be there. And as Kristen says, it is then that I recall what had happened the night before, a non-human being in the room. Because of what happened that night, I cannot sleep alone without a nightlight or some other light source. So this encounter basically gave her chronic insomnia. In most ways, I think that's a pretty typical encounter with what appears to be gray ETs, though their outfit is a little strange. Also, really interesting to me is how the witness was able to overcome this paralysis that we so often hear in these kinds of reports. So many cases of bedroom visitations. I've said this before, but it bears repeating. The most likely place people see an extraterrestrial, or what appears to be an extraterrestrial, is in your own bedroom. They visit a lot of people in their own bedroom at night. So let's move to the next case. This one's really unusual. I call this one, We Will Be Back. This one took place on September 20, 1997 in an undisclosed location in Texas. Technically, it is a single witness case, though there were two people in the room at the time. And there's an interesting aftermath to this case coming from the witness who did not actually view the ETs. But this case is so interesting to me because how the witness was able to terminate her encounter. This first-hand eyewitness testimony comes from Elise. That is a pseudonym. She wants to be anonymous. She was 23 years old at the time of her encounter and had gone to spend the night at her boyfriend's house at an unnamed location in Texas. Now, just a few months earlier, before this evening, she had her first UFO sighting. But on this night, September 20, 1997, she was dreaming. In fact, she was in the middle of a very strange dream about being in a park dressed in Victorian clothing. She said it was unlike any dream she's had before or since. Then she was woken up out of this unusual dream by a, quote, very bright white-blue light. This light came streaming in through the bedroom window, accompanied by a loud humming noise. During this time, her boyfriend was still asleep right next to her in bed. And as Elise says, when I awoke, I was completely paralyzed, feeling like I was floating slightly above the bed, but only by inches. I was completely panicked, horrified, and frightened so badly that I was having a panic attack. I tried to scream, but nothing came out. I saw two small grays at the foot of my bed who were gesturing with their hands and almost kneeling, or they were on their knees, because they were not that much taller than the mattress and box spring that sat directly on the floor. I was fighting to keep my eyes open the entire time. I couldn't turn my head or move any part of my body except my eyes. I was trying to focus on moving my hands or fingers and fighting to move something on my body. So Elise could now see a slightly taller gray walking back and forth past the open doorway of her bedroom. She could see that her boyfriend was still asleep right next to her. And as Elise says, it felt like it went on forever as I struggled to move. I was sweating and tears were running out of my eyes. Finally, I was able to move my pinky finger on my right hand, and I was instantly released. The light immediately turned off, the humming noise that filled the room stopped, and it was like everything was sucked out of the window, like it had just shut off. I heard in my head a chorus of words in a high-pitched foreign language, multiples of the same pitch, almost like a fake computer type of voice. And I instantly heard in English, in the same pitch and tone of the voices, "We will be back." So still terrified, Elise turned on her side and just wept. She was too scared to move, too scared to wake up her boyfriend. She saw that the sun was now coming up, which was odd because at the time of the incident it was pitch black outside. So when her boyfriend woke up, she immediately told him what happened, and his response surprised her. He told her that she was not the first person who had told him this, and he believed that he had been abducted previously, and possibly multiple times. Now they never spoke of this incident again. They later went on to get married and then later divorced. In 2016, she had another UFO sighting, and she says that throughout her life she has experienced a few bouts of sleep paralysis, which, as she says, and I think this is significant, quote, was totally and completely different than what I experienced at 23. So to this day, Elise looks back on this event with some confusion and fear. She believes it may have been a failed abduction, as the ETs had told her, "We will be back." And that is exactly what continues to scare her, because as she says, "I don't know what happened to me. I still don't know, and it haunts me. It took a few days to process. I have not spoken about this to anyone except one friend in the last couple of years. It still scares me. I am still petrified that I have been marked and that this could happen again." So there you go. In some ways a fairly typical case, in others quite unusual. It appears that the primary witness was not actually the target of the visitation and that it was her boyfriend who reported having previous experiences like this. It's also interesting to me that the ET said, "We will be back," which is absolutely not unusual. The witness does feel that this was a sort of foiled onboard UFO encounter. Whether that's true or not is hard to say. I think maybe not, because when she woke up it was already starting to get light. It had been dark previously, which is certainly a red flag pointing towards missing time. But again, hard to say without more details from the witness, which unfortunately we don't have. Always another case, and this next one is also very interesting. I call this one, "It Stood There Watching Me." This is another single witness case which took place one evening in June of 1999, and again an undisclosed location, but somewhere in New Mexico. And I think you'll find this a compelling case. It's interesting to me because this shows how someone can have such incredible fear during their encounter. And yeah, it's just, I find all of these cases interesting, to be perfectly honest. Even your typical humanoid encounter, to me, is a very important case, but the ones I've chosen for you today, I think, do have something to add to our knowledge of what's going on here, and I would include this case in that. This first-hand case comes from a young man, I'll call him Joseph, that is a pseudonym. It was the summer of 1999, around June, and he was staying at his grandparents' home in New Mexico. He does not state the exact location, but his encounter occurred one evening in June of 1999. That day, he and his grandfather had planned a fishing trip and intended to wake up very early, around 4:30 a.m. So Joseph was watching TV in his room until about 10 p.m. and then he went to bed. It was a warm evening and he was trouble falling asleep, so he finally just cracked open the window and went to bed. And as Joseph says, "I have a habit of sleeping with my head partially underneath the covers and my eyes peeking out for some reason. And I think this night explains why. I was underneath the covers, facing the wall, and I saw a green light come into the room. I slowly rotated, trying to not disturb the blankets for fear of what I might see in the room. I had a very uneasy feeling. I started to sweat like crazy and was struck with fear once I turned over. I saw a dark figure standing at my bedside. It had a large head and skinny appendages and a thin body. Once I saw it, I could not move. It stood there for a long time watching me. I could not yell or move. It was only 3 feet away from me. Dare I move and let it know I was awake? I think not. I stayed there calm, still sweating and scared. I eventually hit the point of exhaustion and passed out. I woke up the next morning tangled in the blankets, soaked with sweat and tears. So at first, Joseph told nobody. And in fact, it wasn't until 1 year later that he decided to tell his mom, and her response amazed him. As Joseph says, "Before I even finished telling her about the green light, she filled in the rest of the story. She said the same thing had happened to her when she was about my age." So prior to this, he had wondered if that experience might have just been a weird dream. But after hearing that his mother had experienced the same thing, he now concluded that it was probably a real encounter. It was then that a memory surfaced of another earlier incident. As Joseph says, "I had a dream I was falling from the sky and landed on my bed. However, I woke from this dream by hitting my bed and bouncing off of it. I was as confused as can be. It made me start to wonder if anything else has happened before." To me, the important takeaway from that particular case is that the witness's mother reports also having encounters and sort of filled in the story for the witness. This shows once again that contact is often generational. It certainly looks like that's what's happening in that case. And the fact that he had previous memories of being dropped onto his bed from above the bed, that is something I have heard from a number of times. I always wonder about that, because certainly they could place a person gently in their bed without dropping them. So I suspect that that is done intentionally, is a little bit of a calling card, a wake-up call to say, listen, you've just had contact. I am speculating there, but I've heard it enough times that I really wonder about it. So now let's move to the next case. This one got quite a bit of publicity. I want to give a shout out to Chico for referring me this case. Thank you so much. This one is so interesting to me because it was very, very widely viewed, involving hundreds of witnesses. This is essentially a wave of encounters which culminated in a really unusual humanoid encounter. So I call this one, "Those Things Walked Without Touching the Ground." This took place on November 19, 2008, and over the next 2 days in Claudio, Minas Gerais, Brazil. Hope I pronounced that correctly. I'm sure some of you out there will correct me if I did not, so thank you for that. At any rate, this is a truly astonishing case because it does involve very credible witnesses, police officers, military officers, a lot of people, and photographic evidence and some really, really unusual physiological effects, not to mention the unusual humanoids. So there is a lot to this particular case. This case was researched by many Brazilian investigators and was widely published in the Brazilian press. It involves multiple witnesses and a series of sightings and encounters, including at least one involving strange humanoids. Well, really 2 at least. There is also remarkable photographic evidence. Ronnie Vernay, you can see here, he did a comprehensive article on the case. This occurred in the city of Claudio in Minas Gerais, Brazil. With around 8:30 p.m. on November 19, 2008, that Renata Veloso Guerc Austriaco observed a glowing hexagonal-shaped object and two other glowing spherical-shaped objects rotating in the sky over her home. The smaller objects were rotating around the larger object. So these objects then approached the Nossa Senhora Aparecida church, which you can see here, apparently causing the streetlights in the Bella Vista neighborhood to go out block by block as they passed overhead. Now by this time, numerous people in the town of Claudio were observing these lights. Meanwhile, Renata rushed to inform her husband, who just happened to be Captain Eisenhower Guerc Austriaco, the commander of the Claudio Military Police. So he, seeing these lights, immediately phoned the police station and ordered 3 men, Corporal Hamilton Jose Rabello, Private Heverton Francisco, and Private Balbino, to take a vehicle to Valongo Avenue in Bella Vista, where these objects were now moving. So the lights kept moving, and they were now being seen at Sobrado. This is near the city's industrial park. Very big industry center here. So the 3 men went there, driving along a road that would eventually lead to the town of Matias. Now one of these men, Corporal Rabello, gives his testimony here. As he says, after approximately 1 kilometer, we saw on the right side of the road a very bright yellow and white light that was moving to the right of our position. We turned around and started following the light. Once on the MG 260 highway heading towards Claudio, we headed towards Campo de Aviaso, always maintaining visual contact with the object. We continued to follow it until we got close to the Santa Ynez alcohol distillery. We entered a sugarcane plantation, continued approximately 500 meters through the sugarcane, and reached the end of the fence where it would not be possible to continue. So here they continued to nervously watch this glowing object, which looked to them, quote, rectangular in shape with oval sides, the size and appearance of a bus without wheels. They said this object was blazing with a light that was coming from the center of the object. It moved upwards and they lost sight of it. They were actually getting ready to leave when this object returned. Now Corporal Rabello was ready this time and was able to capture 3 photographs of this object. And others were actually also able to capture photographs. And Corporal Rabello says that the Brazilian Air Force found out about these photos and confiscated them. But at the order of his commander, he had previously saved a copy of them. So this was fortunate, otherwise we would probably not be seeing these photos. And in fact, after this incident, the Air Force told him that what he had seen was, quote, artificial burning of gases. Weirdly, they ordered him to draw what he had seen, so that kind of discounts their explanation. One of the witnesses, Private Balbino, was so traumatized by this incident that he ended up quitting his job as a police officer. But events weren't over yet, because on the evening of November 20th, 2008, Commander Eisenhower and Sergeant Waldir Arrojo Silva were driving on a road through the sugarcane fields in São Bento village when they saw 3 objects disappear at incredible speed. So they pulled over to look, and this is when they saw something amazing. They saw 2 3-foot-tall luminous beings gliding through the reeds. So they were able to approach within 50 to 60 feet of these beings, but couldn't get any closer because they were stopped by a large pond. They could now see that these beings walked without touching the ground. They saw no feet, but they did see arms and legs and an oval head, and these figures were glowing brightly with light, but did not cast any light around them. Sergeant Waldir tried repeatedly to photograph these beings, but weirdly, they would not show up on the photographs. At this time, the witnesses found themselves very disoriented. They said that they experienced a weird fear, along with unusual headaches and body aches, and at one point, Commander Eisenhower tried to reach for his gun, but found that his arm was so heavy he couldn't do it. It appeared to the witnesses that the beings were taking something out of the ground, or putting something back in, working in a very scientific manner. And the witnesses also felt that the beings were somehow affecting both their minds and their bodies, making it impossible for them to do anything but observe. As Sergeant Waldir says, they seem to control our thoughts. leaving our bodies exhausted and unable to think strategically or tactically. The feeling was that we were in a situation where we couldn't define what was reality, what was a dream, and what was a nightmare, and everyone felt and saw the same thing. So finally the beings disappeared. The whole incident seemed to last about 40 minutes, but they learned that actually 2 or 3 hours had passed, so that surprised them. And there were other weird after effects, because following the incident, the vehicles had electrical problems. The witnesses experienced strange physical and mental effects. They said they felt distressed, tired, and sleepy, and very thirsty following the encounter. Other people in the area were having all kinds of weird things happen. Some reported blasts of hot air entering their homes, electrical problems with their vehicles, and get this, a few said that they felt like they had actually physically levitated. And it was later learned that a lady from the village of Formiguinha opened her door and saw small beings in her yard, and up above these small beings there was a glowing object hovering behind the eucalyptus trees near her home. So the next day, on November 21st, the witnesses returned to the site where they had seen these humanoids, and they were amazed to see that there was no small pond there. This pond that had blocked their forward progress was gone. It apparently never existed. There was now just a pasture there filled with reeds and a ravine. And that night there was again some more UFO sightings, and that proved to be the end of this little UFO flap. Thank you again, Chico. Obviously an important case. I really wonder what those ETs were doing. Looks to me that that case was in part a display in that so many people saw this. Photographs of UFOs associated with humanoid encounters are exceedingly rare. So that alone makes that case really important. I really wonder what those humanoids were doing there, because the witnesses felt that they were working there in some scientific capacity, and the effects they had on the witnesses. Wow, really makes me wonder how advanced these beings are. All right, let's move to the next case, which I call I Was So Scared. This one occurred in June 2009 in Ashdown, Arkansas. And this is another important case with some really unusual elements to it, as we shall see. The witness in this case is anonymous. I'll call her Ginny. She lived with her grandmother in an apartment in Ashdown, Arkansas. At the time of her encounter, she was 23 years old. It was one night in June 2009 that Ginny found herself waking up at 2:30 a.m. for no apparent reason. She rolled over and tried to go back asleep, but 10 minutes later she woke up again and started to feel a strange uneasiness. So she went to the bathroom, fixed herself a cup of tea, and sat on the couch watching TV for about 5 minutes. 10 minutes later, she decided to go back asleep. It was now 2:40 a.m., and Ginny noticed that it was unusually bright outside the apartment. So looking outside, she saw a bright light with a dark vertical shadow in front of it, sort of just sitting there in the apartment parking lot. She wondered if it might be a car with really bright headlights, and she just tried to ignore it and go back to sleep. But she couldn't. And as Ginny says, I kinda got creeped out and pulled the blanket over my head like a scared little kid. The light wouldn't go out. I finally calmed down enough to doze off when the blanket started to be pulled off of me from behind. I thought it was my grandma, and I wondered why she didn't just pull the blanket off of me like a normal person would. So I reached up and grabbed the blanket, and whatever it was that was pulling was tugging back. So at this point, Ginny started to realize something unusual was happening, and she became terrified. She wanted to scream out for her grandmother, but she was so scared that she just couldn't get the words out. And then something even more scary happened. As Ginny says, as I'm freaking out under my blanket, a small skinny gray arm with a small skinny hand with really long fingers reached under and got a vice grip on my wrist. The skin wasn't gray, but a very dark grayish brown, maybe close to black. I don't know. I was too busy freaking out. I never saw a face or body or anything that night, just the arm and hand. Then I blacked out. So she woke up some time later, she's not sure how long, and her bedroom was still flooded with light. She heard her grandmother going to the bathroom, so she called out to her and said angrily, "Didn't you hear me yelling?" And her grandmother replied, "Why? Were you looking out the window?" So Ginny thought that was an odd response, an odd question. Ginny felt exhausted at this point, sick to her stomach, so she just went back to sleep. The next day, her grandmother had to go out of town for a week, so this left Ginny alone in the house, and when it came time to go to bed, Ginny found herself filled with anxiety. In fact, she turned on every light in the house and opened every door. Still, she found herself unable to stay asleep, and she recalled that earlier in the year she had, quote, "something like this happen." So the after effects of this encounter lasted a very long time. As Ginny says, "Over the next few months, I randomly wake up at 2:30 on the dot." There you go, another bedroom encounter. Though I have to say there are some details in that particular case that I have not heard very often, particularly the witness describing this apparent gray grabbing her by the wrist. That's quite unusual. Makes me wonder if perhaps she was being taken. Again, hard to say for sure. She's got no direct memories of that. But there's got to be a reason these ETs are visiting this person in their bedroom. Also interesting to me how her grandmother reacted to this encounter. Final interesting detail is that following this encounter, she would always wake up at that exact moment when the first encounter occurred. This is a detail I have heard a number of times from other witnesses. So I'm not exactly sure what that means, unless it's just sort of a post-traumatic sort of reaction to when this first encounter occurred. All right, let's move to the next case. I like this one as well. Technically a single witness case, but very interesting details to it. I call this one, "I Felt No Fear." This one occurred on July 16, 2011 in Cape May, New Jersey. This one is not an isolated event. In fact, I've come to believe that it's quite rare that people have an ET encounter that is a one-off. Almost always, these encounters are something that people live with for most of their lives. They might not remember it, but when someone is a contactee, we know this from researching so many different cases, almost always starts as a very young child and continues throughout their life. And it does appear to be what's happening in this case. I also find this case interesting because of how he described these apparent grays and how they were dressed in particular. When he was a young boy, Donald, that is a pseudonym, experienced frequent and terrifying visitations from mysterious beings entering his bedroom at night. But as he grew up, these tapered off and then stopped completely, so he kind of just chalked them up to dreams and imagination and stopped thinking about them. That is, until one evening in July 2011, when something happened which brought these memories rushing back and made him realize that perhaps these weren't dreams at all. It was July 16, 2011. He and his wife were staying at a bed and breakfast on Beach Avenue for a short vacation in Cape May, New Jersey. Donald was asleep in bed when he woke up for no apparent reason. And as Donald says, "I opened my eyes and saw two beings standing at the foot of the bed, but there was adequate light coming from the street for me to see them very clearly. I estimate that they were between 4.5 to 5 feet tall because I could only see them from the waist up. They were identical in every way. They were wearing black or dark green form-fitting outfits that resembled scuba diving dry suits. These included snug hoods that extended from the back of their necks and over the top of their skulls. On their upper chests was a rectangular gold or bronze-colored plate about 6 by 4 inches with 2 rows of inscribed symbols or buttons on them. It resembled an instrument touchpad of some sort. They were no more than 6 feet from my face, and they were both staring right at me. It was a cool, appraising look, the look a cat might give you. Their crania were very large, perhaps twice as large as a man's, but it was their faces that really got me. They had huge, wraparound black eyes set above high cheekbones. Their skin appeared coppery or orange in color. So he didn't really notice any mouth or nose, but he did see something along the outside of their jaw that reminded him a little bit of gills or maybe mandibles. Realizing that he was awake and not dreaming, he propped himself up on his elbows. He felt no fear, which surprised him, and he just stared at them. And he was about to say something to them when they apparently spoke to each other telepathically, and he overheard them saying, "Something is wrong. He sees us." As Donald says, "I suddenly became extremely sleepy. I tried to fight the urge to lie back down, but it was no use. I felt my eyes closing, and that was it. The next thing I knew, it was morning, and I was awakened by sunlight streaming in through the balcony door." So when his wife woke up shortly later, he asked her about the evening, and she replied that she had received the best night of sleep she'd had in a while. This experience reminded him of the many times he'd been visited as a child and had just written them off as dreams, but now he realized that these childhood experiences were probably real. And as Donald says, "If one thing stands out, it's the sense of almost military precision and discipline that I got from them. It's hard to explain, but I got the feeling that these were no-nonsense men who had a job to do and followed orders to the letter. They were not there to be my friend or tell me any of the universe's secrets. They were under orders and would no sooner go against them than they would one of our Navy SEALs. And one last thing. They were supremely confident and felt not the slightest fear towards me. I am absolutely sure of that." I found that to be a very credible case. The witness is so obviously sincere, and you can see that he was very much able to observe these incidents in a very sort of objective way. I think that's important because when someone is able to overcome their fear, as this witness did, that makes them much better observers. When someone is in abject fear, they're usually not that good at observing the smaller details. But this witness certainly was. I also found it fascinating how he described these beings as being somewhat clinical, having a job to do, being very serious about it. That is a detail I've heard from many other people. So now let's move to the last and final case in this collection. And I have to say, of the 10 encounters that are in this episode, this one probably has the most unusual humanoid. You can make up your own minds about it because some of these cases do involve very unusual humanoids. But this one definitely does. And not only that, the location of this encounter is quite interesting to me. I call this one an alien in the employee bathroom. How about that? This one took place on January 16, 2016 in Pulaski, Tennessee. And yeah, this took place at someone's place of employment. I don't know that I've heard that very much. It certainly has turned up in a few cases I've covered over the years here on this channel, but I would say it's pretty rare. An amazing case, as we shall see. This final case comes from an employee of the Magneti Marelli factory in Pulaski, Tennessee. And it actually took place, again, at this factory. This company manufactures automobile headlights and taillights. The witness is anonymous, so I'll call him Jerry. He was working the evening shift. It was about 8:30 p.m. on January 16, 2016, as he went to the employee restroom. This is near the employee entrance, down the hallway to the left, he says. And entering into the restroom, he saw that it was empty. He was the only one in there. So he finished his business and was washing his hands when the encounter began. As Jerry says, "I felt someone watching me. I turned to see a shiny silver baseball cap, yet flat on top. I thought it was a ghost which kept peeking, with the tip of the brim exposed. Every time this entity tried to view me, it jumped back quickly. I hurried to the small bulkhead wall to see a man with very bright, pale-like gray skin in a silver suit jacket with pants, gloves, and low-top Converse-like shoes with some light gray silver shades. His eyes did not blink. He quickly turned his face into the corner of the bulkhead and was afraid, quivering, and I looked at him from 4 feet away. So at this point, Jerry had still not seen the figure's face clearly and assumed that this must be a shy and fearful co-worker, an employee, who was being ridiculed and tormented by his fellow workers. But it was odd, because he had never seen this man on his shift, nor had he heard the heavy steel doors to the bathroom open. So he felt sorry for this little man, and he said, "I didn't mean to frighten you, but I'm about to leave. It's all right, I'm shy too. I'm about to be done, so I can get out of your way." So he finished washing his hands, and this man kept peeking out from behind this wall. Whoever this man was, he was definitely not a ghost, as Jerry could now hear the scuffling sounds from the man's clothes against the wall. So Jerry spoke again, saying, "I'm leaving now, so the restroom is all yours." And as Jerry says, "I walked towards the bulkhead to start my way out. Then another employee starts to open the heavy steel door, and the human-like entity darts from behind the wall and slides for a split second and looked me up and down and at my face nervously, as if to say, 'You are not supposed to have seen me.' He had long pointed ears, and a thin, bony, pushed-up nose, and no hair around the edges of the cap. There was no emblem of any kind on the clothing. He quickly swung his head around to see if the employee had seen him yet. A portal was opening. As he takes those few steps in between the urinal and the first toilet wall, he ducks his head slightly and leapt into it and disappears. Needless to say, Jerry was shocked. Only then did he really realize just how unusual this figure was. He wondered if it could be some kind of time-traveling alien moving through dimensions or what. He doesn't know. A year and a half after this incident, he decided to file a report because, as he says, "I realized I can't take the unknown and this truth to my grave." So whatever's going on in that case, I think we can agree it's very unusual. I don't think it was a ghost, interdimensional being, extraterrestrial. You can make up your own minds about it, but the way this humanoid disappeared or left the bathroom is very unusual. Though I have to say, not unique. I have heard other cases described in exactly that same way. But I have to say I've never heard a humanoid described in the way that this witness did. So that is absolutely unique. But I will also say that it's not unusual for people to describe completely unique humanoids. They do all seem to be humanoid in form, almost without exception. There are, of course, some outlying cases that don't involve humanoids, but those are so exceedingly rare that they're technically, statistically insignificant. A humanoid form does seem to be the universal template. And I think that just shows what the ETs have been telling contactees forever, since we've been recording contact, that we share a common ancestry, that we share a common heritage. ETs will tell people over and over again, "We are you, you are us, we are one," this sort of thing. So that would certainly explain why people are seeing humanoids that look so very much like us, certainly more like us than they are different. So there you go, 10 really unusual humanoid cases. Really fascinating how these cases come from all over the world, occur decade after decade, and have these incredible commonalities that I think argue tremendously for their veracity. It seems to me it's just impossible for people who are so widely separated in time and space to make up these stories that match so perfectly with each other, and yet also contain these unique details of high strangeness, which just again goes to show there's still a lot to learn about what's going on here. That's it for today, guys. Thank you so much. I truly appreciate you guys tuning in. And until next time, keep asking those hard questions. Keep searching for the truth. Most important of all, keep having fun. And I'll see you next time for a new episode of UFOs and the Paranormal. Bye for now.